Before modern science, people didn't know who to blame when crops failed, plagues spread or children died young. What couldn't be explained was often blamed on black magic, and more specifically witches. Countless people were executed for witchcraft across history on the slightest evidence, with many others unrecorded or dying while stuck in squalid prisons awaiting trial. Here are merely 15 examples of real people killed because rational courts of law judged them guilty, some after the Enlightenment. Why not give kids dressed up as witches a real scare this Halloween, by telling them about the following unfortunate people? Number 15. Johann Albrecht de Delgrief claimed to be a prophet. The authorities thought otherwise. According to Johann Albrecht de Delgrief, 7 angels came to him from heaven and told him to cleanse the world of evil. They even gave him authority to command Europe's monarchs to repent. A learned man from Elbing, modern-day Poland, Delgrief knew several ancient languages and read widely. Most likely, the angels were in fact books, but like most reformers, Delgrief's rabble-rousing speeches in public worried the authorities. Officials seized him at Königsberg, modern-day Kaliningrad, Russia, and condemned him as a witch. Delgrief left this world in the midst of flames in 1636. Number 14. The dreadful witch-finder general, Matthew Hopkins, started his career by hanging a one-legged woman of 80. Matthew Hopkins, the self-appointed witch-finder general, is easily the most cynical and ruthless figure in the history of witchcraft. Between 1645 and 1647, he condemned a staggering 200 people to death as witches, collecting money for every investigation. His first victim was Elizabeth Clark, a one-legged woman of 80 accused by a local tailor she'd quarreled with. After depriving her of sleep for several nights, Clark broke and confessed. She also identified other members of her coven, all of whom represented a tidy profit for Hopkins. In 1645, Clark and 19 of the women she named and shamed were hanged. Number 13. Alce Young became the first American hanged for witchcraft in 1647. Witch hysteria spread to the New World with the arrival of the British in the 17th century. In 1642, Connecticut passed its first law against witches, and in 1645 the settlers executed their first witch. Almost all we know about Alce Young is she was a witch. Records suggest she lived in Windsor, Connecticut, where her husband owned a small piece of land. We don't know for certain, but perhaps she got the blame for Windsor's deadly influenza epidemic of 1647. She hanged for witchcraft in Hartford, Connecticut in 1647. 30 years later her daughter was also executed for witchcraft. Number 12. Alce Young just pipped Margaret Jones to this title. Hot on Alce's tail came Margaret Jones at the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1648. Details about the accusation are again sketchy, but Jones worked as a midwife and folk healer. Such professions were enough to make someone a witch. Presumably, babies died or fell ill and once again the midwife got the blame. The Massachusetts prosecutors carried out investigations based upon Matthew Hopkins's published methods, and subjected Jones to sleep deprivation. Her guards reported seeing her familiars come and visit Jones in prison. She denied all charges, but the court hanged her immediately after delivering the inevitable guilty verdict. Number 11. Sharp-tongued Jean Gardner hanged for witchcraft in colonial Bermuda. Another settler in the New World found herself out of luck in 1651. Jean Gardner left Britain to start a new life in Bermuda. Gardner quarreled with other women on the island and threatened to punish them, and some later suffered unrelated misfortune. Witch mania followed the British wherever they settled, and so soon people whispered she was a witch. A jury of women searched Gardner for a witch's mark, made by the devil like a cattle branding. Twice they threw her in the sea off St. George and she floated. This unequivocally proved her guilt and she hanged. Number 10. Edinburgh executed Major Thomas Weir, a celebrated soldier, after he voluntarily confessed to witchcraft, incest and bestiality. Everyone in Scotland loved Major Thomas Weir, a celebrated soldier, Presbyterian and politician, but in 1670, he suddenly confessed to some appalling crimes. Without coercion, Weir announced that he'd committed incest with his sister and stepdaughter, bestiality and been a witch. Weir admitted to making a pact with the devil and owning a magical staff. No one believed him, but his sister corroborated everything and admitted to keeping familiars. The court of Edinburgh had no choice but to reluctantly execute one of the city's most celebrated sons. Both were hanged and were burned to ashes. The siblings were likely insane. Number 9. And Losit celebrated Christmas with Satan, and burned at the stake in 1679. One of the last witches executed in Norway lived in Sunnmøre in the late 17th century. Like many witches, Anne Losit was poor, and had to beg to make ends meet. When refused, hunger and desperation made her scold and threaten others. She made the threats during a period of intense witch persecution, and soon she found herself charged with witchcraft. A priest convinced Anne to confess to harming livestock and the usual witches' crimes. She even told the court she'd spent Christmas with Satan up in the Dovrefjell Mountains. In 1679, Anne burned at the stake and roved. Number 8. More evil children made Bridget Bishop the first of 19 people executed during the Salem witch trials. Remember poor Margaret Jones? Well, John Hale, erstwhile supporter of the Salem witch trials, visited her in prison and watched her hang to death. Like the witches of Warboys, possessed children accused the Salem witches and caused their deaths. These young girls had read tons of English witch pamphlets, and made claims plagiarizing these celebrated accounts. Long story short, 200 people wound up accused through hysteria, accusation and counter-accusation. The first of the 19 victims, Bridget Bishop, denied all allegations, but had plenty of testimony against her, and the court decided she was a liar. Bridget hanged in 1692. Number 7. Mima Renard's success as a prostitute saw her burned for witchcraft in Brazil. Witches often found themselves accused of having monstrous sexual appetites. Witches were thought to use black magic to seduce men to satisfy these urges, hence the modern verb to bewitch someone. Mima Renard, a beautiful Frenchwoman living in Brazil, fell foul of these beliefs. After an admirer murdered Renard's husband, she had to turn to prostitution to make ends meet. Furious, cuckolded wives decided she must have bewitched their husbands. When two married clients fought a fatal duel over her, Renard was arrested for witchcraft. The authorities agreed this amounted to sufficient evidence, and burned Renard to death in 1692. Number 6. The 6 Paisley witches suffered the last mass execution of witches in Western Europe 1697. Western Europe's last mass execution of witches took place in Scotland in 1697. An 11-year-old girl, Christine Shaw, suffered fits and in her delirium, or hostility, accused 7 women of bewitching her. She also vomited pins, feathers and other strange items. Doctors could find no medical cause for her condition, and local authorities began an investigation. Those questioned made allegations in turn, and soon 26 people were accused. At their trial, the judge warned the jury that acquitting the accused would make them accessories to the crime. 7 people were found guilty and hanged, including a 14-year-old boy. Number 5. Ruth Osborne died during a witch swimming in 1751. Many accused witches died without leaving a trace, the victims of unrecorded mob violence. Ruth Osborne is an exception. She drowned at the hands of a mob, but we still know her story. Ruth and her husband, John, lived in a Hertfordshire workhouse. One day Ruth begged some buttermilk from a farmer. He refused, and when his calves fell sick, blamed the Osbornes for bewitching them. Some years later, the farmer was at a pub, and raised a rabble to swim the old couple. Ruth drowned during the mob's test, 39 years after the last execution of an English witch. Number 4. Why made Ursulina de Jesus' husband infertile? Witchcraft. People thought witches made men infertile. The Malleus Maleficarum even cites an example of a witch keeping severed penises in a bird's nest up a tree. Ursulina de Jesus lived in Sao Paulo, Brazil, with her husband Sebastian, an important city figure. When Sebastian realized he was infertile, he naturally blamed Ursulina. The city's officials arrested Ursulina for witchcraft. Testifying against Ursulina alongside Sebastian was his mistress, Caesarea, who confirmed that he was indeed infertile. Poor Caesarea lamented that she couldn't have any illegitimate children with her lover. This evidence was sufficient. Ursulina burned at the stake in 1754. Number 3. Anna Goldie, the last witch in Switzerland, died by beheading in 1782. Anna Goldie is known as the last witch in Switzerland. In 1765, she became a maidservant to a magistrate. 17 years later, her employer claimed to find needles in his daughter's food, and accused Goldie of putting them there by magic. Goldie escaped, but was caught, confessed to cliched witchcraft after brutal torture, and beheaded. But where did the allegations come from? Historians suspect she had an affair with the magistrate, who had political ambitions and wanted to hush the relationship up. The Glarus Parliament exonerated Goldie in 2008, and there's even a museum named after her in Enenda. Number 2. Leatherlips, a Native American leader, lost his life after unfounded witchcraft allegations in 1810. Leatherlips, leader of the Wyandot Indians, made himself really unpopular in the late 18th century. He wished to cooperate with white settlers and agreed to a truce with them, the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. He also sold Wyandot land to the whites, angering 2 Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. As revenge, the brothers accused Leatherlips of witchcraft, and enough Native Americans resented the peaceful leader to try him. They found Leatherlips guilty in 1810, and he died by tomahawk at the age of 78 in Ohio. Number 1. Bridget Cleary's husband murdered her in 1894, and she is known as the last witch burned in Ireland. When Bridget Cleary didn't come home on time one night in 1894, her husband, Michael, feared the worst. When she returned, he accused her of being a witch pretending to be the real Bridget. Bridget refused to confess, so Michael and his co-conspirators made her sit naked on a peat fire. Still she refused, but at last with her body terribly burned. Furious, Bridget accused Michael's mother of consorting with fairies. Enraged, Michael poured lamp oil over her and set her alight. Michael buried Bridget in a shallow grave, and did 20 years hard labor for her murder.